Not at all. Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we'll be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. While you're turning to this text, let me just ask you a few questions and see if you're like me, if at times this applies to you. Have you ever felt like in your life that everyone is against you? That nobody understands you? Have you ever felt like everything you try to do, you turn up only making matters worse instead of actually making things better? Do you ever feel like even though you don't mean to do so, you're constantly hurting those people that are around you that you love? And I guess the most important question of all is this. As you look back at these different issues that you face in your life, do you realize that you truly are the one to blame for these things? All of these feelings are horrible, aren't they? They're feelings that none of us like to have. And when we're in the midst of these feelings, it makes it very difficult for us to really handle life in the way that we should. There's a great lesson that we can learn from the Bible in situations just like I've described. When we start to feel these different things taking place in our life, if we look and see what the Bible says, we can learn much about how to deal with these times in our life. Here in 1 Samuel chapter 30 and verses 1 through 6, we're going to find King David being talked about. As a matter of fact, this was before David was actually king. David dealt with all of these feelings all at the same time. And by studying 1 Samuel chapter 30, we're going to learn how David dealt with these feelings when they came into his life. So what I would like us to do is this. Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. Let's read down through the text. Then I would like us to notice some things about the context, the other verses around this section of Scripture. And then we'll look at how David dealt with these feelings that he was having. Listen to what's said in 1 Samuel 30, verses 1 through 6. This is an actual historic event that took place in the life of David. And it came to pass when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away, and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captive. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept, until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives were taken captives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. Boy, what a horrible scene is taking place here in 1 Samuel chapter 30. Here you have King David returning back to a city where him and his men were dwelling at the time, and they find out that the city is now in ruins. One of their enemies, the Amalekites, had come in and taken over the city. And as they took over the city, they took their loved ones out of the city. And so here David and his men return back to Ziklag. They look over the city and they realize the people who were the most precious in their lives were now gone. They had been taken by force. And I'm sure in their minds they were wondering whether they were dead or whether they were enslaved or what type of abuse they were facing at the hand of the Amalekites. It was a horrible time, that's for sure. But for us to really understand this text and understand what David must have been feeling, we have to look at the context. We have to look at some of the verses that come before this section of Scripture for us to really understand what had taken place that led up to this horrible situation that David was facing. Let me give you a real quick summary, and I would ask you, if you have the time later, take the time to actually read down through these different verses I give you to help you to understand more about what David had gone through previously before this event in his life. Let's begin in 1 Samuel chapter 27. In 1 Samuel chapter 27, you'll read in verses 1 through 7, the idea is this. David is fleeing from King Saul. In his flight, David chooses to run to the nation of Philistia, where the Philistines dwelt. Now you have to keep in mind, the Philistines were the enemies of Jehovah. So David is now running to the enemies of God to seek refuge from King Saul and his men. As David flees to the Philistines, the king of the Philistines at that point in time allows David and his men to stay in the city of Ziklag. That's a city in the borders of Philistia. So David and his men were allowed to hide in the city of Ziklag while he was hiding from King Saul and the Israelite army that was after him. Okay, if you move on further then, in 1 Samuel 27, 8 through 12, here's what you're going to read about. David and his men would go out at night from the city of Ziklag, and they would take over other Gentile cities, and they would rout the cities. But David didn't tell the king of Philistia about this. When the king asked David what David and his men were doing, David lied to the king and said, "We were going out and fighting against the Israelites." So here you can see the king of Philistia, who was enemies of Israel. He believed that David was, in a sense, joining forces with him. He thought that David was opposing the Israelites as well. Really, David wasn't. But David had lied to the king and made the king think that David was on his side. Okay, it goes on then. If you read in 1 Samuel 28, 1 through 2, the idea is this. Because the king of Philistia, his name was Achish, because King Achish believed David's account, because he believed that David was fighting against the Israelites, the king of Philistia decided to enlist David in his army. He wanted to fight side by side with David because he believed the lies that David had told him. Now, if you continue on in that same chapter, in chapter 28, beginning in verse number 3, you're going to find when they go out to war, well, matter of fact, this is in 1 Samuel 29, 1 through 11. When they go out to war together, there's a big problem. The captains of the Philistines did not want to fight with David. They were afraid that when they would be in the midst of the battle against Israel, that David would turn on them and take Israel's side. So even though King Achish believed the lies of David, the captains didn't. And they refused to go to war against Israel if David was going to accompany them. Okay, King Achish is left with no other choice but to send David and his men back to Ziklag. His captains wouldn't fight with David. They refused to go to war against Israel as long as David accompanied them. So Achish says, okay, you're not going to fight with David. I have no other choice. I'm going to send David and his men back to Ziklag so we then can continue on in this trip to fight against the nation of Israel. Okay, folks, that's the entire background of what we just read. And if you remember then, here in 1 Samuel 30, we pick up with David and his men coming back to Ziklag. Okay, here's what we have to understand, though. We have to stop and think about some of the decisions that David made that led up to this event in 1 Samuel 30 that we just read about. Let's stop and think about it. First of all, when Saul was tracking down David and his men, who did David run to for help? He ran to the enemies of Jehovah. He ran to the Philistines. That's sin number one. The Lord made it plain in those times that that his people should not rely on the heathen Gentile nations, but they should look to Jehovah for their safety and their security. David chose to ignore that. He chose to run to the Philistines for his safety and security. So that was sin number one. Okay, remember then, David leads his men against the different Gentile cities that surrounded the city of Ziklag, where he was living with his men. When King Achish asked David what he was doing, David commits another sin. He lies to the king and says, "King, we've been fighting against Israel." When really they haven't been fighting against Israel. They've been fighting against the other Gentile nations. That was sin. I'm not even going to say mistake. That was sin number 2 on the part of King David. Okay? Number 3. Achish, because he believes the lie of David, what happens? He invites David to come and fight with him against the Israelites. Okay, now we're not told what was going on in David's mind. All we know is David did agree to join Achish. Now maybe David in his mind thought, if I join Achish when we get in the heat of battle, I can turn on Achish and take Israel's side. Maybe that was his intent. The Bible doesn't say. All we know is David did agree, at least outwardly, he agreed with Achish to join up with him to fight against the Israelites. If David intended to fight against the Israelites, obviously that's sin number 3. Because the last thing David wanted to do now was to turn on God's people and fight against them. Now again, we don't know for sure if that was what was in David's mind or not, so we're just going to leave it at this. We know he committed 2 grave sins. Perhaps 3. But the final thing I would like us to think about before we go any further is this. Think about the Amalekites going in and taking over the city of Ziklag, where David and his men and their families were living. Why would the Amalekites want to take over Ziklag? If you study about Ziklag in the Bible, it was basically a poor city. It had nothing much in the city that anybody would want. That's one of the reasons why the Philistines had allowed David and his men to live there. Why would the Amalekites attack the city of Ziklag when there's really not a lot of riches there to get? It was because David and his men had previously attacked some of the cities of the Amalekites. Remember, they went out and attacked the Gentile cities. They had previously attacked some of the cities of the Amalekites, and this was the Amalekites' way of getting back at David and his men. They went to the city, most people believe, specifically to get David's family. They waited until they knew that David and his men had joined the army of Achish and they were moving toward Israel. They were out of town, going to war against Israel. That's when the Amalekites moved in and took over Ziklag and took all the families out. It was their way of getting back at David and his men for attacking their city to start with. So you can see how, in a very real sense, in at least 3 ways, perhaps 4 ways, David was personally responsible for what took place in Ziklag. He chose to join up with the Philistines to start with. The Lord wasn't pleased with that. He lied to the king, which eventually led to him being out of the city of Ziklag when the Amalekites attacked. He had attacked the cities of the Amalekites, which motivated them to come in and get the families of his men. And finally, again, if David actually intended on joining Achish against Israel, that would be another sin that would be involved in this chastening from the Lord that was taking place. So I hope you can see how when David and his men came back to Ziklag and when they saw their families gone, David had to be feeling a tremendous amount of distress. Here he knew how he had sinned against God several times. He knew how the very men who had taken his families captive were the very men that they had previously attacked. So you can see now that I hope sheds a little bit of a different light on these verses we just read in 1 Samuel 30, verses 1 through 4, because now you can see what's taking place. David knew what had taken place in the city of Ziklag was his fault and his fault alone. This was the chastening hand of God falling upon David, reminding David that he was clearly out of the Lord's will in several different ways, and now he was going to feel the results of that. Okay, let's take it a step farther. It says in verse number 6, and David was greatly distressed. This is 1 Samuel 36. David was greatly distressed. Do you know what the idea of greatly distressed means? It comes from a Hebrew phrase. The Hebrew phrase for greatly distressed means when you feel overwhelming pressure coming upon you from all sides. They use it to picture like a man going into a real tight cavern where he can barely fit in the cavern, and there's walls about him on every side, and he feels tightly pressed against those walls of the cavern. That's what David was feeling. He was greatly distressed. He was feeling pressure on all sides now. You might say, why is that? Well, let's stop and think about some things. First of all, again, like we had said originally, King Saul and the nation of Israel were now against David. The other Gentile nations that David had just attacked are now against him. Also, now that Ziklag had been ruined, and since Ziklag had been attacked, that proves the Gentile nations knew where David and his men were residing. So that added to his pressure. Now they had no place to hide anymore from these other Gentile nations wanting to come and attack him and his men. Not only that, King Achish, the king of the Philistines, he was apt to hear about why the Amalekites attacked one of his cities. Eventually it was going to come out now. Can you imagine what he would think when it came out that his city had been attacked because David had been attacking the other Gentile countries around his? Can you imagine what that would have been like to know that David had lied to his face, and now his city had been destroyed specifically because of David and his men? I hope we can just begin to see some of the pressure David was under. It doesn't stop there, though. David lost both of his wives in this attack. So now he doesn't know if his wives are dead. He doesn't know whether they've been abused. He doesn't know whether they're enslaved. He doesn't know what's happened to them. All he knows is it's not good. We read here in verse 6 that even his own men now are blaming David, and that's why they looked back and they saw all these bad decisions David had made. They had trusted David with their life and the lives of their families. And now they realize, look at the choices David made that led us down this path, and here we are now at the end of the path. Like my father used to say, the bear is coming back down the road now. They're now facing the results of all that they've done, and they had done it under the leadership of David. They had trusted David to lead them in a way that was pleasing to the Lord and that would keep them safe and secure with their families. David had done just the opposite. I guess probably the worst thing that I can think of as far as the pressures on David is the fact David realized he had sinned against the Lord. Can you imagine David now looking back and realizing the different sins he had committed? What enormous pressure was put on David in that way to know, Lord, I'm the one responsible for everything that has taken place. If just one Israelite, just one member of my men's family dies, I am responsible for their death. I'm responsible for any abuse they're going to suffer. I'm responsible for a series of sins that have led us down this road. I don't know what tomorrow's even going to hold in my life now, because I can't count on you blessing me, because I know that I have sinned horribly against you. Can you imagine the amount of pressure that David felt when you combine all of these different things we just talked about? That's why I say what David must have been feeling as he was going through this event in his life, it must have been devastating. Look at verse number 6, at the last part. But, okay, here's the but. After all that David had felt, after all that David was going through, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. Excuse me. David chose to think about the Lord. When everything else was said and done, when David had come to an end in himself, when there was no other place to look for help, David looked to the Lord. Folks, now be honest, how often have we done that, where we'll try everything we can to get out of a situation, or we'll do everything we can of our own wisdom and knowledge to try to lead our life in the way we think it should go, and we end up falling flat on our face and totally failing. And that's when we finally look up to the Lord. Let me tell you something, folks. That's exactly what took place in David's life now. After all that he had done, after all the sinful decisions he made, after all the sins that he had committed, after all the pain that he has felt, after all the pain that he's brought on others who were so faithful in trusting him, after hurting those who were willing to help him in his time of need, he now looks to the Lord. You know, it's a sad statement in a way to think that that's what it took to get a man to look to the Lord, that he had to go through all of this to bring him back to the Lord. So in a way, it's a sad statement to think about it from that standpoint. And yet, again, we've all experienced that in our lives at one time or another, where we have gotten to an end in ourselves and we finally had to look to the Lord. But also in another way, the phrase, and David encouraged himself in the Lord his God, is a very wonderful statement. Because the idea is this: no matter what situations we may face, no matter how difficult they may seem, no matter whether we caused them or we're simply the victim of circumstances that were out of our control, it really doesn't matter. The one thing we can know for sure is this: all hope is not lost. We can still find encouragement in the Lord, no matter what may have taken place in our life. And again, I ask you, please remember David's situation. How could it get much worse at this point? I mean, you stop and think about all that he's gone through, what he's experiencing. How much worse could it get? And yet we're told here, we're not told, and David tried to encourage himself in the Lord his God, but he failed. See, it doesn't say that at all. It says David did still find encouragement in the Lord. Even after all of this, David was still able to find encouragement by turning his heart and his mind to the Lord. Folks, if you're facing a similar situation in life, this is the key to it all. Turn to the Lord. Now, we're going to talk a whole lot more about what it means to turn to the Lord in part number 2 of this study. It's only 2 parts. I've tried to lay this morning the background of what's taken place in David's life so we understand the best we can what David was feeling as he turned to the Lord to find encouragement. I think it's important that we understand all that he was facing at this point in time, because again, I don't think it could get much worse. You know, there's many things in life that we face today that seem to be very difficult, and they are very difficult many times. But I think we all would have to agree what David was facing right at this point in his life could not get much worse. For most of us, we have never faced a situation quite as bad as that. And yet David was able to find encouragement in the Lord. What a wonderful blessing for us to know. So again, what did David do then? How did he find encouragement in the Lord? In the very next part of our study, we're going to be looking at, let me get this for you, it'll be Psalm number 4. The reason why we'll be looking at Psalm number 4 is this. Most Bible scholars believe Psalm number 4 was written at this point in time in David's life. Most people believe Psalm number 4 is what David wrote as he was looking at Ziklag in ruins, realizing all that he has done to bring this to pass. David then sits down and pens Psalm number 4. And in Psalm 4 we're going to find the encouragement that David is able to gain as he thinks about the Lord and as he thinks about specific truths about God. That's what we're going to look at, Lord willing, in our next study. It'll be, what does David do specifically to find encouragement in God after all these horrible things have taken place in his life? And again, I remind you, many of these he caused himself. That's important. That's a part of his distress. Let me just say one more time before I close, folks, keep in mind, it's one thing to face horrible events that you couldn't help. You know, you were just a victim of some circumstance and now you're stuck in this mess. That's tough. But it's even tougher to look back and realize you're the one to blame for the mess. It's tougher to look back and say, you know, I can see specifically where I sinned against my God leading up to this point where I'm facing right now. That's even worse because now we have to take responsibility for the mess we're in. That was David's position in this. That's what David was feeling. And we'll see in our next study, Lord willing, he's going to pen Psalm 4 to help us to explain how he dealt with all of these feelings of guilt, loss, sorrow, regret. You know, the list goes on and on. So I ask you to please join with me next time for part 2 of our study on But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. May the Lord bless you as you study his word.